I have a lot of acronyms for you today, and I'm going to cover a lot of information. So if everybody would have a seat, then we can get started. Okay, as Carla mentioned, my name's Lisa Williams. I'm one of the attorneys for the university. I've done this talk several times, so if you've heard me give it before, I apologize. It's going to be a lot of the same information. Today we are going to talk about OPT, CPT, and H-1B. I said there's lots of acronyms. So now, is it Mr. McGee told you how to find a job. Now we're going to talk about how to stay in the country with that job. Okay, you all should be on F1 visas. Does that sound familiar to everyone? Yep. Some J's in the room? Okay. F1 visas, non-immigrant visas, allow an individual to enter the United States as a full-time student. You must be enrolled in school. You all know this. This is where you are currently. Okay. Optional practical training. You all have probably heard of this. This is something that Carla, I believe, helps you apply for. This is kind of your first step out of the gate after graduation. It provides F1 students an opportunity to gain practical work experience in the United States in a field directly related to the student's academic program. You can apply for 12 months of OPT at each education level. So if you do a bachelor's degree, you get 12 months. If you go on to get a master's degree, you get 12 months. If you do a PhD or something like that, you get 12 months. To work, you must obtain your EAD. That's your employment authorization document. Your DSO needs to provide you with a new Form I-20 indicating the recommendation for employment. You have to jump through a few hoops you need to file. You can't just assume, based on approved OPT, that you can work. You need to have proof of that authorization to work, basically, is what that's talking about. Most students use 12 consecutive months after graduation. You can actually use it in bits and pieces, though. You can break it up if you need to. So there's also a type of OPT that is specific to STEM. If you are a major that has to do with science, technology, engineering, and math, then you might be eligible for a 17-month extension of your OPT for a total of 29 months. It's only available for post-completion OPT. It can't be split into 2 or more periods, and it can only be used once per student. So you don't get that extended OPT for each level. Yes. And yes, we can do questions as we go along.
Is business a science?
No. No, unfortunately. You know, they look at that pretty limited. Yes?
How is that not discrimination?
Against
I'm an English major, I just feel that discriminating.
Well, the reason why we do this, basically, is because we need math and science.
Right.
So, yeah, unfortunately. I was an English major, too, so I feel your pain. But unfortunately, that's...
But it's not science, technology, English, and math.
Right.
Okay, unemployment on OPT. So say that you graduate, you get a job OPT, you do it for 6 months, and then they say that they're done. You are allowed to have a brief period of unemployment and still maintain legal status. If you're on your initial 12-month period, you can't accrue more than 90 days of unemployment. So for example, in my situation I just gave you, you've worked for 6 months, then they tell you that they don't need you anymore. You would have 3 months to find a new job. Once you if you find that job within 3 months and you begin employment again, then you're fine. If you then get laid off again, then you would be done. You can only accrue a total of 90 days. Does that make sense? Okay. If you're on a 17-month STEM extension, you cannot accrue more than 120 days of unemployment during that entire 29-month period. So you do need to try to remain employed, which makes sense because that's the whole reason that you're staying in status. Okay, curricular practical training. I am going to go fairly quickly through this. Feel free, if you have questions, stop me. We're going to do some questions at the end too, so if you feel more comfortable doing that, that's fine. F1 students may also be eligible for curricular practical training if it's an integral part of an established curriculum. This is going to be your internship situation. So, for our English majors, say that you got an internship at Johnson City Press, and you were gonna do an internship during your class schedule. You would be able to do that for a certain amount of hours per week, part-time. It doesn't count towards your OPT time unless you do it full-time for at least a year. So you do need to watch that. That's one thing to be aware of. If you're doing an internship, make sure that you don't use up that OPT time. F2 visas. If any of you have dependents, you know about this. This is just a dependent of a student on an F1 visa. This is in here because we talk about dependents for H-1Bs, but we're going to move past this. I will send this PowerPoint to this. It has a lot of information on it. I will send it to Carla, and she will send it out if you all would like a copy of it. Okay, after completion of your program, so you've graduated. Congratulations. When you entered the United States, you were issued an I-94. Nowadays, they're actually electronic, so you're not really issued one, but you all should be vaguely familiar with that concept. It is what indicates your status in the United States. And it also has very important information about how long you're authorized to be here. For F1 students, it's going to say duration of status, or DS. That means that you're allowed to remain in the United States as long as you're enrolled in your academic program. What that also means is that if you drop out of school, then your status ends. If you graduate, your status ends. If you're participating in OPT, your I-94 essentially automatically extends for 12 months if you're doing the regular, or 29 months if you're doing the STEM. After completing your program, you have 60-day grace period to depart the United States. The end date will be the program end date on your Form I-20. So your Form I-20, say that you're graduating this year. Your end date on your Form I-20 may be May 15th, the end of the school year. You would then have 60 days from after May 15th to leave the United States. You can remain in the United States after that time only if you've taken action to remain status. To do so, you can start working on a new degree, which you would just get a new F1, or you would apply to change status to another visa status, for example, H-1B, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Like I mentioned, other visa options that you may want to consider, H-1B is going to be your primary option. You may be able to consider an O. Those are rare, but it does happen. A green card, of course, is the ultimate goal if you plan to stay in the United States long term, and there are others. There is a visa for every letter of the alphabet, essentially. So there may be something that we're not covering today that you would qualify for. Generally, you would mainly be under the H-1B, though. Okay, so what is an H-1B visa? An H-1B is a non-immigrant visa. That means that you don't intend to stay in the United States forever. It's a temporary visa. It allows a U.S. employer to temporarily employ foreign workers in specialty occupations. If a foreign worker in an H-1B status quits or is dismissed, the worker must either apply for or be granted a change of status to another non-immigrant status, find another employer, or leave the United States. So what's important there is that an H-1B visa is specific to an employer. For example, we have probably roughly 100 people who are in H-1B status at ETSU, professors, doctors, those type of people. If we fire them, then they go out of status. If they quit, they go out of status. They need to find a new visa. Their visa is only good so long as they work at ETSU. Does that make sense? Yes.
How much time do we have, roughly? Just any worker who quits?
How long is the H-1B visa good for?
I mean, like, you know, if it expires, obviously, with quitting the job.
Oh, 10 days. Yeah,
10 days?
yeah, you have 10 days. Yeah, so if ETSU, so all those individuals who are on H-1B visas, if we fire them today, they have 10 days to leave the country. Yeah, so, or find another job and get another visa in 10 days. So that's probably not going to happen. So yes, 10 days. So that 60-day grace period on the F1 sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. No, so that's really bad if you get fired. You have to pick up your life. I don't know that I have another slide that mentions this, but since we're talking about it, if you also get fired, the employer actually has the obligation to pay for your plane ticket back to your home country. So in that situation, if ETSU, no, that's a good thing. You don't have to pay for your plane ticket. If the employer does fire you, then the employer basically sends you home. So H-1B visa basics and requirements. H-1B status is reserved for individuals who fit, let's pay close attention to this, professional level jobs and specialty occupations. That's the key, specialty occupations. An H-1B visa is employer sponsored. Like I mentioned, it's specific to an employer. H-1B visa requirements, a position that requires a bachelor's degree or higher. And Sorry, that's language from internal. The employer must pay the prevailing wage for the position. So when you file for an H-1B visa, you actually have to go onto a government website and you look at your area and the job and the education level, and you put a few different things into a metric, and it tells you how much that individual needs to be paid. If the employer can't pay that amount, then the employer can't have that employee, cannot offer that person a visa. That is actually to protect foreign nationals, so that we don't bring foreign nationals in and offer to pay them very low wages in exchange for a visa. So the specialty, let's see, do I get into, okay, sorry. The specialty occupation on the last slide, that is very important. It means that not everyone's going to qualify for an H-1B visa, unfortunately. It means that the way that the USCIS offices that grant H-1B visas usually determine that is that a job has to be specifically related to your education. For example, I have a degree in law. I would not be able to get an H-1B visa to be a soccer coach because it's not related to what I know how to do. There's no reason that I would be any better at it than anyone else, and it doesn't require any special knowledge. Here's a different thing. Say that you have a business major who is a soccer coach who wants to get an H-1B visa as a soccer coach. You still can't do it because a soccer coach does not require certain education. Does that make sense? So that's a problem that we hit quite often. It's very easy to get a doctor or a professor an H-1B visa. It's much more difficult to get other occupations like coaches, things like that, that don't have an education that specifically pertains to their degree. So, unfortunately, what that means is that the arts, sometimes those more general degrees like a business degree or an English degree, those can be more difficult. Yes? A major and a minor. It depends. It depends on how they relate it. So, if say that the job ad requires, and it all goes back to what that job ad asks for. Say that the job ad requires some education, some classes in a certain area. A minor may be enough. If your major is not at all related to the job, it's probably not going to be enough. So it's a hard balance to hit. And it really is case specific. So if we have, more questions about that, we can definitely talk about the specialty occupation thing at the end. Yes?
It says here that this visa is employer-sponsored. I heard that in some cases the company that you work in doesn't want to sponsor you, and you have to pay for that money. How much you have to pay?
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I actually wanted to, that relates to something that was mentioned before. And you even mentioned discrimination. Okay, so we all know in the United States you're not allowed to discriminate based on whether someone's a foreign national, marriage, age, those types of things, right? We are essentially allowed to discriminate based on immigration status. It's not discrimination because an employer does not have to choose to sponsor you for a visa. That's what's important there. An employer, say that you want to go work for Mountain States. Mountain States, they bring you in for an interview and they say, are you authorized to work in the United States? Usually they would put that on a job application. You say, no, I would require sponsorship. At that point, they are allowed to disqualify you. They don't have to consider you. That's depressing, I know, but it is the case. If the employer is unwilling to pay the cost of an H-1B visa, they're not permitted to hire you. They cannot shift that cost to the employee. It's actually very strictly enforced that an employee cannot pay that cost. So that situation shouldn't happen. It would be illegal. But they can decide at the get-go that they're not willing to put up with the time and effort that it would take to get an H-1B visa.
Okay, so in that case, because it's not considered illegal to ask if we're citizens or if we're allowed to work in the U.S., is that on our side that we have to put in our cover letter or email whenever we're applying to the job or in the resume that we need to be sponsored to be able to work in their company? Is that our requirement, or do we have to wait for them to ask us?
It's not a requirement legally. I would advise that at the very least, when you're at an interview, that you should mention that you would require H-1B sponsorship. At the very least. I wouldn't put it in a cover letter. Most of the time it will be in an application. It'll say, it is illegal for them to ask, just to be clear, if you're a citizen. It's not illegal to ask if you're authorized to work in the United States. So that's most of the time what it's going to ask. Are you authorized to work in the United States? You would just say, and at that point you would just say no, clearly, and they should know you don't really have an affirmative duty to self-report that you're not permitted. It will come out at some point, but ideally you would prefer that it come out a little further along in the process. So, yes?
Coming back to what you were just talking about earlier, related to your field of study, can you tell us the difference between OPT and H1? Like, they have this requirement to have a directly related field. Some of the fields are so that they overlap, or if you have a master's degree and you have a doctorate degree, which can be blended in together. Is it okay?
I believe that an H-1B is actually a little broader than OPT. I think OPT has to be a little bit more closely tied to your academic study. H-1B, it just has to relate in some way. And it's, the job has to require, that's kind of the important thing, the job has to require whatever skill set you have. The reason for that is so I mentioned before that we're trying to protect foreign nationals by making sure that certain wages are paid and things like that. The specialty occupation is actually designed to protect American citizens so that jobs basically aren't being taken away by people who are, they want, if foreign nationals are going to come in on H-1B visa, they want it to be because that individual is more qualified for the position. Does that make sense? So, so we just want, so it just has to be very tightly tied to your qualifications.
Does the degree level also, like some of the jobs they mention, you need to have a bachelor's. If you have a master's or if you have a doctorate degree, do you need to, can I apply to something which requires only bachelor's?
Yes, yes. So long as you meet all the job requirements in the job ad, then you're fine. It won't necessarily give you an advantage, but you would still meet the requirements. Okay. Yes?
Does the employer have to make the case that my personal skills are those that are needed, or do I have to make the case?
No. So say that you go and you apply for a job, and they're going to offer you an H-1B visa. The employer is actually responsible for filing that entire process, for pursuing it. The employee does not almost take any part in that process. So for instance, when I do it for someone here, say that we hire a professor, they let me know that they've chosen a professor. I then contact that individual, get certain information from them. I fill out all the paperwork. I make the argument, but the argument does have to be made. You do have to prove that that connection exists, that they meet all the base requirements, and then it's granted. And we are actually the holder of that H-1B visa. So the employee in that situation is just a beneficiary. Does that make sense?
We've talked about, Carla talked about specifically an English major, it's so spongy, but it might be an advantage because it's so broad.
Right.
You could go marketing or advertising perhaps. I
Yeah.
was just wondering who needs to make that case.
Well, and if the job advertisement requires an English major, then you're golden. That's fine. You won't have an issue getting a H-1B visa. If the job advertisement just generically requires a bachelor's degree, it's hard to say that that's a specialty. So that's kind of where the issue lies. And that's common. The job advertisements will just require a bachelor's degree. It's hard to make the argument that that's a specialty in that situation.
When you think about strong communicative skills, writing skills and stuff, is that usually enough?
They really don't consider that when looking at whether it's a specialty or not. It really comes down to your education because they do base it on the bachelor's requirement. They will, with an English degree, your employer will have a few hurdles to jump with trying to prove that it's a specialty occupation. So, and it's been done. It's been done. I mean, There's no hard and fast rules with this. You can get certain things approved certain times that won't go through another time. So it's definitely not a lost cause. It's just that there may be an additional hurdle.
And what about in Marco's case in particular? He has, his major is English, but he also has he has 2 other languages. So
That's a perfect example, yes.
yeah, he's multilingual. Now that gives him, I mean, that could be an advantage for lots of jobs.
Right.
So with that, the fact that he meets the, he's got at least a bachelor's and it's English, and
Right.
then they could make a case, couldn't they? Someone.
If the job required proficiency in whatever language that you speak, that would be enough, in addition to the bachelor's degree.
Counts as education, yeah.
Enough, yeah. It's a skill set that's so specific. It's a lot more specific than, for instance, like good communication skills or high quality writing. It would be specific enough that you could definitely make that argument. So
Proficiency in foreign language.
exactly. The arts do have. This is more. I mean, this is something like you said that is trended towards benefiting the more technical majors. H-1B visas just tend that way. Okay, if you're not depressed enough, let's get a little bit more depressing. So there's a thing called the H-1B cap. So you apply for a job, they're willing to offer you an H-1B visa, they have to contend with something called, your employer would have to contend with something called the H-1B cap. So each year on April 1st, the American government opens up 65,000 H-1B visas. It was this week. Every individual who wants an H-1B visa across the nation applies on that day. They all go into essentially a lottery, and 65,000 are approved within pretty much the first week. It'll close in a few days. It hasn't closed yet. But it's already too late to file, kind of concept. So that's a huge issue. So if you want to file for a job, if you apply for a job in December, you can't get a visa till April, right? Potentially. The first 20,000 petitions filed on behalf of beneficiaries with a master's degree or higher are exempt from the cap. So that gets you to 85,000. So if you have a master's degree or higher, you may be able to get in under the cap. You're still going to be subject to those same time restrictions. Here's what's good for us, and something that you all want to consider if your main goal is to stay in the United States. This is a good point. H-1B workers who are petitioned for by employers of institutions of higher education, nonprofits, and government research organizations are not subject to the cap. That means that because we're an institution of higher education here at ETSU, I can apply for H-1B visas any time of the year, and I don't have to fall into this number. We can have as many as we want, and we can get them whenever we want. That's any college, any nonprofit, and any government research organization. So those are really great places to look for jobs. Other places, it is possible, but it is more difficult. The USCIS begins to accept H-1B petitions on April 1st. An approved employee can begin employment on October 1st of that year. So if you are getting an H-1B visa through the cap, say that you were graduating this May, you would have had to apply this past week, and then you could begin work this coming October. So it causes some time issues. Any questions about the cap? It's kind of a confusing concept, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds with it, but yes?
Can you take the OPT and work on OPT before the October 1st? And then
That's an awesome idea. That is the best case scenario for anyone graduating. So the best case scenario is that you will graduate and use your 12 months of OPT. During that 12 months, your employer would have time to start this process. You would be able to go through the April 1st deadline, and they could apply, and then you would basically be good until October 1st through another convention that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So that's exactly what you would want to do.
can you change status while you're here, or you have to go home to?
No, you can change status without any problem from OPT to an H-1B. So, to make it just a little bit more complicated, and I apologize, this is the nature of the beast. So if we do that situation that you just mentioned, where you graduate in May, you do your 12 months of OPT, so your OPT will end in May. You're not allowed to legally begin working until the next October, right? There's actually a convention in place. As long as your H-1B is pending, they'll let you work during that gap. It's called an H-1B cap gap, and it just means that you could continue employment so long as everything was pending. So the important part of this for you all is to know that you need to stay, if you've applied to a position, they've accepted you, and they're going to offer you a visa, you need to stay in very close contact with whoever is handling it through that employer. Often, employers will hire attorneys. Most of the time, places do not have someone in-house who handles H-1B visas. If an attorney is handling it for the employer, then you need to stay in very close contact, make sure that you are aware of all the deadlines and that everything is basically proceeding as it needs to. Because if they miss a deadline, it's very serious. And it can mean that you'll have to return home and therefore lose the position that you got. Okay, that's a lot of information. I have this in here so that you guys can read it when I send this out. This basically talks about the eligibility for that cap gap extension. If you're really worried about the details like this, you're welcome to give me a call, to email me, or ask me afterwards. Again, just one point. So if your H-1B is denied during that time that it's pending, then you would have the traditional 60 days to leave the country, the 60 days based on your F1 status. If you're in that cap gap period, so if you don't technically have status, but you're here only because your H-1B is pending, you cannot travel. It causes significant issues. That's true of any immigration status. As you guys move forward through the immigration system, if you're ever in a status where something is pending, you need to be very careful about travel. Okay, timing. H-1B visas are issued based on the anticipated length of employment for a term of anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So generally, they'll be granted for 3 years if you intend to be employed indefinitely. Most of the time, they'll be granted for 3 years. H-1B visa can be renewed for a maximum period of up to 6 years. So if your first H-1B petition is approved for 3 years, then you only get one subsequent 3-year period for the total 6 years. If you intend to remain and work in the United States for longer than 6 years, you need to look into getting a green card. Currently, typical H-1B visa petition processing time is approximately 3 to 4 months. Actually, now it's more like 4 to 5. It is a detailed process, so you also don't want to talk to an employer about hiring you. Say you're in your OPT expires in 1 month. You need to be a little more proactive than that. You should try to get an employer to begin an H-1B process for you probably at least 6 months before your current status expires. H-1B visa dependent. So if any of you have children or spouses and you get an H-1B visa, your spouse would get an H-4 visa. And that's filed with the H-1B visa petition. It's an additional filing fee of $290 per dependent, and that is payable by the employee. So in this entire process, that's the only fee that the employee should be paying. You may need to hire, sometimes employers will make the employee hire an outside immigration attorney to handle that dependent visa. It just depends on how that particular employer decides to handle it. H-4 visa holders are a little bit more limited in what they can do. They actually just passed it so that they can work. Up until now, they hadn't been able to be employed. H-1B visas, things to consider. So this is kind of what I want you to leave you all with. I know I've given you a lot of information. These are the things that I want you to think about as you move forward in your career and attempts to stay. Do I meet the minimum requirements? Bachelor's degree or equivalent job requirements. How would the cap requirements and the timing affect me? Is the potential employer willing to pay the associated fees for an H-1B visa? Am I interested in obtaining permanent residence? Would the potential employer be willing to sponsor my petition for permanent residence? That's another thing. So say that we hire a professor. He works here for 6 years on an H-1B visa. At the end of it, he has 2 options. He can go home or he can get a green card. A green card, there's a lot of different ways to get a green card. You guys have all seen the movies where people get green cards by marrying an American citizen. right? Everybody seen those movies? I think you guys are going to sleep. Yeah, you've seen them? There's several movies. You guys go watch some movies.
There's one called Green Card.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the easiest one to find.
Yeah, there you go. It's a convention. If you marry an American citizen, then you get a green card through that. I wouldn't advise that. There's easier ways. No, I don't know. That might be the easiest. So
Don't do it just for that reason.
no, do it for love. That's right. You can get one through an employer. I don't have a lot of information about that on the slides, but for instance, say that we hire a professor here at ETSU, and we bring him here, we offer him an H-1B visa. We really like this guy, we're interested in him working here long term. Shortly after we get the H-1B visa, so in that 6 years, right around the 3rd year, we'll begin the green card process. It's a very long, drawn-out process. If you're early in your career, then it's a very, very long, drawn-out process. It is the timing is actually based on the country that you're from. If you're from India or China, then it will take 5+ years. If you're from maybe France or Canada, it's going maybe a year or two. And it just depends on the country. It actually, what's that? African countries are not bad. There's the shorter, not bad. No, and the reason for that, let me tell you just to give you an idea. The reason for that is that you're actually put in line behind everyone from your specific country that is applying for that same kind of green card. So that's why India and China are long waits, is because there's a lot of people coming from those countries trying to get those green cards. So some of the African countries, especially that are smaller, the wait might actually be very, very short. If you do green cards that are very specialized, if you wait until a little further along in your career and you get a little bit of notoriety, you become very good at what you do. There's types of green cards that we can get. I got a green card approved in 2 days a few months ago. So it just depends. So that's why we don't talk about it a whole lot here. It is something that you should consider if you get an H-1B visa. I would advise considering it around the 2nd or 3rd year of your visa so that you can allow plenty of time for that process. Okay, what to expect while in H-1B status. H-1B visas come with a wide variety of rights and benefits. You get a driver's license, a social security card, multiple year duration, no requirement to maintain a foreign residence. You can change employers, so long as the new employer is willing to offer you an H-1B visa. You can have multiple employers, so long as each employer is willing to offer you an H-1B visa. You can get dependent visas. Your dependents can attend school and college. Unlike the J visa, there's no Conrad requirement, so you don't have to return home at any point. You have the ability to petition for permanent residence, and you have the ability to take leave, travel without losing status. Traveling on an H-1B visa status is much more simple than even traveling on an F. Okay, any questions? Yes?
Just one, and if you go to OPT, say you graduate in May, you applied for OPT, if you didn't find a job yet, is that the third 3 months starting?
I believe so. Carla might be able to answer that a little better than I can.
Well, it would depend on what we choose as your OPT start date. So if you graduate in May, you have 2 months from graduation to request the OPT, or that's the latest you can have as your start date as well. So if you put July 8th as your start date, then you'd have until October 7th before you would have to be employed by then, or you would have used up your 3 months.
So you get your 60-day grace period and then your 3 months, okay?
Yeah.
Yes?
We've talked about the, in an online application asked, do you have a work permit? And we would have to say no for H-1B visa if we're in the process of getting it. Now I applied for a few jobs and I said yes all the time, even though I don't have the OPT, but I have applied for it and I'm technically working. Have I done something wrong?
You mean you're not working yet? You've applied for the OPT.
I've applied for the OPT and now I'm on applications.
You've
I
said
just
you
said
have.
yes and I have a work
I
permit.
would say I would consider that okay for the purposes of what you, yes, you will have the OPT or you won't be able to work.
Right.
You're gonna have to show them the employment authorization document at that point.
Yeah, and so in a year if I apply for an H-1B, I technically am working at that time and I have a working
No,
permit, but I don't have it
That would be illegal right there. That
Well-
second thing that you just said is not permissible. You can, since you know that you will have status through OPT, you can now. You can't.
That was kind of guaranteed, essentially.
The point of the question is to ask, do we have to sponsor you? You don't want to begin a relationship with an employer that way, trying to get through the.
It is very ambiguous though, because it asks, do you have a work permit?
Usually it
do.
should ask, are you authorized to work in the United States? That's the language that's kind of that the standard. At that point, you will not be, for their purposes. You would not be authorized to work in the United States without them doing something, taking some action.
So the question should really be, will you be authorized? Right?
It may say, will you be authorized? But either way, no matter how it's worded, your answer should be no. Yeah.
But wouldn't you, wouldn't it be okay to say no, currently on OPT would require H-1B sponsorship?
And that would be fine if you want to, if it gives you an option to explain, then.
Probably not an option there.
And that may be something that you want to do, like in your cover letter. If you feel like that's a flag that is going to cause you issues, maybe an idea. It's a difficult balance. I understand it's a difficult job market, and to have more hurdles is certainly difficult. But I will tell you, our students do find work. Ideally, if you can get whoever you do your OPT with to offer you an H-1B, that's the best case scenario.
What I worry about with that question, is that some employers, I don't think understand the H-1B process at all, or even know it exists. And so
Right, and those
if you say no to that, then they're thinking, oh, you're not legal, you're here illegally or something, why are you even applying?
If they're not aware of the process, they're not going to offer an H-1B visa. Frankly, it's only if it's a small enough employer that they're not familiar with the process already, they're not going to be willing to go through the process. In that case, the best situation, saying that you are legal to work in the United States essentially is lying on a job application. That's so even if you got further into the process and you explained, I would need you to offer me an H-1B, they wouldn't hire you. So, yes.
So, as you said, that small employers might not know. I just kicked into my mind. Do bigger employers, more reputed companies have an advantage over small employers, just in case if they have knowledge about H1 as well?
Only because they're probably more familiar with the process.
So what you're saying is if a small employer has a very good attorney,
Exactly.
might be able to get through.
Yes. If a small employee, if you say that you meet someone who owns a business with 3 people this afternoon, and he just really likes you, the gentleman who owns the business, and you tell him, I can't come to work for you, I would need an H-1B visa. He says, I don't know anything about that process, but I'll get an attorney, we're going to make it happen. They would have no less trouble getting it than Apple or GM or some huge company. They don't have any advantage, or they shouldn't. They do.
For the applicants, that means, that it would be more likely to get a job and get funded with bigger companies.
It only because a bigger company is probably more likely to have the money and opportunities. They're more likely to maybe have an in-house attorney that they don't have to pay somebody to do it. Things like that. So it's just pure. You may find very small companies who are very familiar with H-1B visas and would be fine offering one to you.
What is the cost, roughly, the hiring attorney, in case that is asked of an applicant?
Sure. So the cost of just filing an H-1B visa is you have to pay a $500 fraud fee, a $325 filing fee. So it's just the cost bare minimum to the USCIS is $825. I'll tell you, local attorneys who do immigration charge about $3,000 for an H-1B visa. So you would be looking, and that's like the bare minimum. Often it's about $4,000. So your employer would be looking at a $5,000 expense if they had to hire an outside attorney. So that might be why, that for instance is why ETSU, they hire enough that they have an in-house attorney to do it for them. So again, you wouldn't have to cover that cost. It would be an employer cost. Did you have a question?
Yes. If you are hired in a nonprofit or educational, and most of these would hire you on a contract basis, a short-term contract.
Mm-hmm.
How can you secure your H1 because there's not much grace period once you end your job? So how can you make sure that, after this 1 year of contract, they're gonna rehire you or?
Unfortunately, you can't. So, for instance, say that you go work for a nonprofit that's giving you a year contract. Most likely your H-1B will only be for 1 year. That first approval will only be for a 1 year period because they're going to tie it to your contract. If a month before your contract ends, the employer decides they're not going to bring you back, they should have already filed for a new H-1B. Generally, they would need to start doing things about 6 months before you expired. So you should know earlier than that. But if an employer decided not to do anything until a month before the end of your contract, and they just said, we're done with you, you're done at the end of your contract, at the end of your H-1B visa, yes, that's something we didn't address. If you naturally term out, so your contract's over, your visa's over, you have 10 days to leave. It's that same concept. You go home, you look for a new job here, the new place that's going to offer you an H-1B visa, unfortunately. But no, there's no way to stay, to make sure that you stay in status other than to stay on your employer earlier, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months before the expiration. And if they say they're not going to renew, then you can have time to find a new job.
Okay, and you can do that once, or can you?
You could hop as many times as you want. In that 6-year period for H-1B visas, you could have 110 jobs. It's probably not, it's probably going to get hard to get the jobs after you keep switching, but no, you can switch as many times as you want. Each employer has to file a new H-1B for you, and you can't exceed 6 years total. Those are the only restrictions. And an important thing, at the end of 6 years, if you don't have a green card, you've just hit the end of your 6 years, you go home for 1 year, you can come back and you get a new 6 years of H-1B. So you have to spend 1 year out of the country. So, worst case scenario, you do 6 years, you don't get offered a green card, you go home for a year, you can come back for another 6 years and get your green card during that time. Yes?
But at the end of 6 years of the H-1B visa ends, if you, at that time, you are in the process of the green card application, that means the auto end of the green card application, or you're still in the line to get the in the process of the green card application?
So if that's the case, if you've gotten to the end of your 6 years and you say that a green card was filed at the end of year 3, but it's still pending because you're from one of those countries where it takes a really long time, there's a few triggers there that are very specific. There's 2 different steps of a traditional green card process. There's 2 different forms that have to be filed. If that second step has been pending for more than 1 year, then you get to extend your H-1B for 1 year periods after the 6 years. So in that situation, about 6 months before the end of your H-1B, the employer would need to file for an H-1B extension, and you would get a 7th year in that narrow instance. And the employer would just keep filing for 1 year extensions until the green card was approved.
So the instance where you have to go home and then perhaps come back for another 6 years, do you need to have an offer from here before you can come back, or you just apply?
You would have to have an offer and someone offering you an H-1B if you were going to come back on an H-1B visa. If you were going to come back on a tourist visa for a short period or something, you wouldn't, of course. So you might, to interview or something, come back on a tourist visa.
Then the stem, you say the stem is for like 29 months. Is it something you get an extension of 17 months after the first 12 months, or it's an outright 29 months?
It's a 17-month extension.
17 months.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so let's assume you have your first master's degree and you decide not to have an OPT, you go straight for another master's degree. At the end of the second master's degree, you still just add the 12-month degree.
Yes, you get one 12-month per, and you can't add them together.
It's per.
So right, so you can't save up your OPT to use all at the end. You only, at the very end, you would still only get one.
So for each master's program, I have an OPT already?
Yes, but you have to use the OPT immediately after graduation. Yes.
From the master's, I use another OPT.
What's that?
I think he doesn't
Or I'm
get
saying is,
that at the
if
same
I,
level.
if I have a master's program now and I graduate, I do an OPT,
Yes,
then I apply for another master's.
yes, then you get another OPT.
I can do another OPT,
Yes.
right?
But I thought you only got it once per level.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right, that's true, that's true. I'm sorry, no, Carla has a good point. You only get it once per level. You can't just keep doing master's degrees, you have to go to a PhD.
Okay.
Yes,
So if you do a master's and you get, and it's in a STEM field,
Okay.
okay?
Yes,
And
thank
you
you.
do a 12-month OPT. Before the end of that 12-month OPT, you would need to apply for the STEM extension.
Okay.
Provided you apply before the OPT ends and, you know, you're working for the right type of employer, it has to be an E-Verify employer, then you'll get the 17 months.
Okay.
So then you've got 29 months total, but then you're done with it at that level. If you do another, a doctorate or something, you would get another same thing if it's in STEM.
Okay.
Well, no, you wouldn't, you'd only get the 12 months.
Why you change an employer, like, you use the first 12 months and then in the process of filing for the 17, there is a change of employer, is it possible, like, you use a 17-month extension with another employer?
Are you asking if you can switch employers during the 17-month STEM extension?
Yeah.
If they both are E-Verify employers, but you wouldn't want to quit that job, the first one, until you already had, an offer and everything and were ready to go at the second one.
because as we mentioned, you only get that 120 days of unemployment, so you want to be careful not to lose your STEM. Any other questions?
Is there sorry.
You're fine.
Is there a job ad requirement? Because I've heard from people that it has to be placed in a certain way.
That's for green cards.
H1 and green-
Yeah, green cards are fairly easygoing about job requirements. Green cards require very specific, very, very, very specific things to be in a job ad.
So how can you be sure if you want to continue in the same company, say for H1 and green card? If
That's the
when
emplo-
you apply for H1, they probably did not put the ad out.
Right.
the same way.
Often, I'll tell you what happens here is that we have to re-advertise a position. If when an initial job advertisement was put out, green card wasn't being considered, then we will often have to actually completely do a new job search with no intention of hiring someone, just to get things in the right manner. That's the employer's responsibility. That's not something that you should lose too much sleep over. But no, there's nothing you can do about it. And frankly, the employer will probably mess it up, and they may have to go through that kind of process. Yes?
Okay, so I'm currently a graduate student and my visa, F1 visa will expire right when I'm completing my program.
Right.
And I want to go ahead and do PhD. So do I need to go get another F1 visa back home or Canada?
That is a question for the ladies in international studies.
Can you repeat the situation?
I mean, my visa expire, my F1 visa expire right when I complete my graduate program. So if I want to go ahead and do a PhD program, do I need to get another F1 visa?
Oh, no, we could transfer your CVIS record to another institution, or if you're gonna do it at ETSU, you can continue on with the program level change. The only time you need to worry about you're talking about the actual piece of paper in your passport is gonna be expired. Yeah, that doesn't matter until you leave the country. So the first time you leave after it's expired, you're gonna need to renew it when you go home. But you can be here, indefinitely, really, with that expired. That's just saying that you have until that date to enter. And so if you need to enter after it, you just get a new visa at the consulate.
So the visa has ETSU on it. So if I'm applying to another school, would they need to put that piece of paper there?
Not if you ask us to transfer your CVIS records
Okay.
within the time that you have to do that, which is 60 days
Okay.
after you're done. As long as we do that, then they see in CVIS that you've transferred your status to another institution. And the fact that that visa said ETSU, that it's fine. Except that, again, when you leave and need to come back, then you'll need to apply for the new visa anyway because it's expired. And then it will have the new institution because you'll have their I-20 at that point.
Yes?
After I get the EAD card, the OPT date starts, and when the potential employer asks me, am I authorized to work in the United States, should I answer yes?
If you have OPT authorization, you're authorized. So it's just after that OPT when you say that your OPT is expiring in a month or two, at that point you really don't have authorization for those purposes, unless you plan on only working for that employer for a month or two. But no, at OPT you definitely are authorized. Yes?
So basically, whenever you get the OPT card, you're good. You can say in your application that you're authorized to work, right?
Yes. Yes?
Is there any job alternative related to our major that we can do it before our graduation? I mean, CPT, is that offered?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
The CPT?
CPT, yes, for an internship or for something that's related. That's something I don't deal with much. That's again something that you might need to ask international studies about if you have questions about CPT, about finding it or about the process or.
I mean, based on our visa F1, we can do CPT.
Yes, you can do CPT.
If it, I mean,
If it meets the requirements, yes. But yes, if it meets all the requirements, then yes, you can do it. Yes?
So let's imagine I have working visa. What is the earliest time I can start working on my green card, or they can start working on the green card? Is it 3 years, or can they start
What-
after a year?
So if you got hired today on an H-1B, they could start your green card today.
So right away?
They can start it right away. We do that sometimes.
So it just depends what country you're from.
On how long it takes? It depends what country and what kind. If right now, when you are fairly young and you've graduated fairly recently, you're going to be one of the lower levels of employment-sponsored visas, which just means that there's a few more steps that you have to jump through, and it is based on the country, on how long some of those steps take. But if you're from a country that takes less time, and
How
they,
do we find out like what countries take what?
what country are you from?
Ukraine.
Ukraine would not take that long.
Okay, good.
It would be it's just kind of, there's a list on the internet that actually gives you specific time periods, but it's just kind of general. Sometimes it may be longer than others, so I can't give you an exact period. I would expect, if I were to file a green card for someone from Ukraine today, I would expect to have it in hand within probably 1.5 to 2 years. So if you found an employer that offered you an H-1B and you got approved for a 3-year period and you started the green card at the beginning, you could have your green card before your H-1B even expired.
And then I can do whatever I want.
Then you can do whatever you want. And with a green card, you can work for whoever you want. You're not tied to that employer. If you get a green card through an employer, you can leave that employer. You can go. You have every essentially right as an American citizen, limited to only voting and things like that. Yes?
Yeah, just a question, I'm not sure if it's related to the visa or not. Does ETSU hire people outside, like from like other than professors and lecturers, like in the administrative offices and all that? Just getting to know more about it.
For like an administrative position, generally they will not offer administrative positions H-1B visas. I believe it has happened in the past, but it has not happened in the last 3 years. So unfortunately, you would have problems linking. For example, if you applied for like an executive aide position, it wouldn't be a specialty occupation. So that would be what would, because your degree most likely wouldn't link to it. Yes?
What if it's like something like the HR or training and development, which is not professor, but it's also not really administrative?
If you have a degree in HR or something closely related, then that would be enough.
Can educational leadership be linked to that?
It may be able to. It may be able to. HR at an educational institution, you may be able to get educational leadership to count.
Yeah.
It would be an argument. I couldn't guarantee one way or another. The department would have to be willing to offer you the position, would have to be willing to pay those fees, and then it would still even be a gamble.
Because those kind of fields are very broad. There is no such thing as educational leadership job.
Right. No, I understand. I understand. Those super broad degrees do pose problems with H-1B visas. Okay, if anybody else has any questions, you're welcome to ask me afterwards. And like I said, I will send out I'll give Carla the PowerPoint. Thank you guys for your patience. You were a good audience, and let me know if you need anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.